The rooftop terrace smelled of rain-drenched cedar and the cloying, expensive scent of my mother's vintage perfume. It was a heavy, suffocating atmosphere that seemed to cling to the fine silk of my graduation gown. I stood at the edge of the glass railing, watching the city lights blur into a hazy, neon smudge, and I felt a strange, detached buzzing in the marrow of my bones. My father, Silas, was currently tapping his heavy gold signet ring against a crystal flute, calling for silence among the dozens of high society guests who had gathered to celebrate my master's degree in international finance. I looked at Silas. His face was a mask of practiced, aristocratic warmth, but his eyes were as cold as a winter morning in the mountains. Beside him, my biological siblings, Leo and Genevieve, were exchanging a look of such concentrated, predatory smugness that it felt like a physical weight in the center of my chest. For 24 years, I had been the grateful project, the child they had adopted from a fractured system to bolster their public image of philanthropic benevolence. I had worked 3 times as hard, stayed twice as late, and maintained a flawless, unblemished reputation just to earn a seat at a table that was never truly mine. "Tonight is about milestones," Silas announced, his voice booming effortlessly through the humid air. "Astrid has completed her education, and as she steps into the professional world, it is time for our family to clarify its future. To ensure that the legacy we have built for 5 generations remains exactly where it belongs, within the direct, biological lineage of our house." The air in my lungs seemed to turn into thick, gray static. Time slowed, warping the faces of the guests into grotesque, silent caricatures. Silas didn't look at me as he continued. He simply announced that the family trust, the trust, I had been told, was my safety net for over 2 decades, was being officially, legally restructured. Effective at midnight, all non-lineal descendants were being permanently removed from the capital distribution list. My stipend was gone. My inheritance was deleted. And the penthouse apartment I had called home for 4 years was being reclaimed for Genevieve's new interior design studio. I didn't feel the urge to scream. I didn't feel the heat of anger. Instead, a profound, crystalline silence settled over my mind, sharper than any blade. I watched a single, microscopic bead of condensation slide down Silas's glass. I focused on the way the humidity made his tailored suit jacket pull slightly at the shoulders. He thought he was serving me a life sentence of obscurity. He thought he was finally discarding a tool that had outlived its public relations utility. But he was entirely, fatally unaware that he had just handed me the master key to his own financial cage. For the past 18 months, I had been living a double life. While my family saw me as the diligent student working part-time at a mid-tier accounting firm, I was actually the lead anonymous consultant for North Star Acquisitions, the very private equity powerhouse that Silas had recently hired to manage the extreme, uncontained debt of his failing shipping empire. Silas was a man who lived on the illusion of liquidity. He projected an image of vast, impenetrable wealth. But beneath the surface, his company was a hollowed-out shell, held together by high-interest bridge loans and the very trust fund he had just clarified. I quietly stepped away from the railing and took a seat at the table, my expression as unreadable as a blank spreadsheet. Leo leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and deep-seated entitlement. "Don't take it personally, Astrid," Leo whispered, his voice vibrating with a sickening schoolyard malice. "It's just DNA. You were a guest here for 24 years. Now the party's over. Maybe you can find a nice, modest job in a suburban bank, if they don't mind your complex background." I turned my head slowly to look at him. I noticed the tiny, frantic twitch in his left eyelid, a sign of the severe anxiety he usually hid behind his father's shadow. I didn't respond with words. I simply gave him a small, polite, and entirely empty smile. The metallic ringing in my ears had faded, replaced by the rhythmic, comforting hum of the legal and financial trap I had already set in motion weeks ago. I knew Silas's biggest vulnerability: to hide the fact that his shipping firm was technically insolvent. He had been moving massive amounts of capital from the family trust to cover his operational losses. It was a delicate, highly precarious dance that required a very specific, very rare type of blind management. He had signed a contract with North Star Acquisitions because they promised him complete discretion and a creative restructuring of his debt. But he didn't know that I was the one who had drafted the terms of that contract. The agreement Silas had so eagerly signed contained a very specific, ironclad clause regarding the purity of capital. It stated that if the family trusts, the primary collateral for his massive corporate loans, underwent any significant structural change or beneficiary removal without a 90-day notification period, the entire debt would be immediately, aggressively called in. By stripping me of my beneficiary status tonight without the mandatory notice to the firm, Silas had just triggered a $14 million with liquidity crisis. He had essentially pulled the pin on a financial grenade and shoved it into his own pocket, all because his ego couldn't handle an adopted daughter sharing his lineage. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in quiet, surgical dismantling. I didn't call Silas. I didn't answer Genevieve's gloating emails about clearing out my closet. I moved my essential items into a secure luxury hotel suite, using the private consulting fees I had been quietly accumulating in an offshore account. And then I officially authorized North Star to initiate the compliance audit. The psychological shift happened on a rainy Thursday morning. Silas called me exactly 14 times in the span of an hour. His voice, when I finally decided to answer, was no longer booming or aristocratic. It was raw, frantic, and laced with a terrifying, unadulterated panic. "Astrid, there's been a massive misunderstanding at the firm," Silas stammered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "North Star has frozen all our operational accounts. They're calling in the bridge loans. They're saying the trust is in default because of the restructuring I announced at dinner. You work in finance. You have to talk to them. Tell them it was just a preliminary announcement. Tell them I'm reversing it." I stood in my hotel room, looking out at the gray, misty skyline. I felt the smooth, cold surface of my phone against my ear. The air in the room was silent and still. "I can't do that, Silas," I replied softly, my voice devoid of any warmth or recognition. The contracts were very clear. You prioritize the biological lineage above all else. And as a result, the firm has decided to prioritize the strict, legal recovery of their capital. You made your choice. You clarified your future. This is simply the cost of that clarity. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. For a long, agonizing moment, I could hear nothing but his heavy, ragged breathing. He finally understood. He realized that the grateful project hadn't just been watching him, she had been measuring the precise thickness of his financial neck. The final collapse occurred at the family office during a mandatory liquidity summit. Silas sat at the head of the long mahogany table, looking 30 years older. Leo and Genevieve were huddled in the corner like frightened animals, finally realizing that their rightful inheritance was nothing but a mountain of unpayable, toxic debt. I walked into the room wearing a sharp, tailored black suit that cost more than Genevieve's entire designer wardrobe. I wasn't there as the daughter. I was there as the lead representative for North Star Acquisitions. Silas's jaw physically dropped as I took a seat directly opposite him. He looked at me, then at the legal team flanking me, and the last shred of his arrogant facade finally disintegrated. "You?" Silas choked out, his eyes wide with a sudden, suffocating realization. "You're the lead consultant? You're the one who drafted the default terms?" "I am the one who ensured the firm's interests were protected, Silas," I said, my tone perfectly level. Echoing coldly in the sterile room, "You taught me that legacy is about preservation." I simply applied that lesson to my own career. Since you have officially declared me not family, I have no personal interest in the survival of your house. North Star will be seizing the family estate, the shipping firm's primary assets, and the trust's remaining capital to satisfy the outstanding debt. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate the penthouse. Genevieve let out a high-pitched, pathetic sob, clutching her mother's arm. Leo sat paralyzed, staring at the floor, his smug dimples replaced by deep lines of crushing terror. They were staring into a future of total, permanent obscurity. "Astrid, please," Silas whispered, leaning across the table, his hands trembling violently. "We can fix this. I'll make you the primary heir. I'll give you everything. Just stop the seizure." I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my jacket with slow, rhythmic precision. I didn't feel the heat of victory. I didn't feel the urge to gloat. I simply felt the immense, heavy relief of a job finally completed. "You can't give me what you no longer own, Silas," I said, my voice as unyielding as granite. "You spent 24 years reminding me that I was an outsider. You were so busy guarding the entrance to your vault that you never noticed I was the one who built the lock. And now, the lock is permanently, legally closed." I turned my back on the pathetic, crumbling ruins of their shared arrogance and walked out into the bright, blinding light of the hallway. I didn't look back at the people who had treated me like a secondary character in their own grand narrative. A family is a foundation, but a foundation built on the exclusion of others is nothing but a beautifully designed trap. I walked out of the building and into a city that was finally, truly mine, leaving them to drown in the cold, silent depths of their own hollow lineage.